Doukhobor translated to English means spirit wrestler. We came from the Christian tradition, the Greek Russian Orthodox tradition. So we were given that name in derision with the accusation that we were wrestling against God and the Holy Spirit. Our people took their own interpretation, saying that we were wrestling with God and the Holy Spirit to develop a way of life more consistent with the teachings of Jesus Christ. In reflecting, I'm sure that there are people from every tradition that question some of the facets, the dogma, the tenets, the principles of those traditions. And so therefore, if you are a person from another spiritual tradition that questions the inconsistencies in your respective tradition, I think you can also be called a spirit wrestler. And I think that our world would be better off if we had more spirit wrestlers.
I'd like to make some mention of this wood pile here with these replica guns. They represent the burning of arms, and the Doukhobors believe in non-killing society. So in Russia, they laid their arms down and they burnt 8,000 weapons. They were persecuted for that and tortured. So this represents what they did in Russia.
After we destroyed our weapons, in 1899, almost 8,000 of us came to Canada in 3 boatloads.
Well, the government basically wanted the Doukhobors to come to Canada. They're good farmers. They sowed and broke about 700,000 acres. Keep in mind that when they came here to Canada, they left with everything that was just in a trunk. So in that sense, you know, and it wasn't a luxury cruise line that they were traveling on. It was like a cattle boat, and lots of death, lots of sickness. And once they arrived in Canada, like, they were quarantined for 60 days because there was rickets involved and there was lots of illness, you know. This structure here is 424 square feet, and archaeology has taught us that 9 families shared it, which was 40 people. So it was burrowed into the side of a hill, just like they did in the mountains back in Russia. It only has 3 walls, and the back wall was dirt with a sod roof.
In addition to potential disagreements or issues with the government, there were issues within those immigrant groups themselves. The bottom line was that the Doukhobor community ended up fracturing into 3 distinct groups. The independent Doukhobors that made accommodations, compromises with the authorities and retained their lands here in Saskatchewan. The majority were not willing to compromise, especially with respect to the ownership, communal ownership, education, the swearing of oaths of allegiance. And because of their refusal to do that, they moved to BC between 1908 and 1913 and established themselves in South Central British Columbia. People spent a lot of energy, time, effort, love in attending to the land, and then they basically left it because of their moral convictions. And that's not to say one group's moral convictions were higher than another's, but people were called to make decisions, and that's the way they decided at that time.
My family, they're from Saskatchewan originally too, from around, my father grew up around Berrigan, and when the migration from Saskatchewan started, they moved to BC in 1936. So we grew up in our own culture, or whatever you want to call it. We never went to English school. And our education was a little bit Russian, but English, no. So as you see, my English is not that good.
They use this spring, it is named Ospania, after the village, which is a quarter of a mile across the road. So when the Doukhobors came and they used this place here for washing their clothes, they tell us that they used a stone, a rock, not a washboard, where some of us might hear about our grandmothers using a washboard to wash clothes. They used a rock, as Dunya is doing that today.
Sadly, friction developed within the Doukhobor community. All these issues stigmatized the entire community, And again, that offended the Doukhobor people living in Saskatchewan that just wanted to be law-abiding citizens and carry on with their lives and at the same time maintaining their heritage. So it wasn't pleasant for them to hear or read about some of the actions taking place in BC.
You see, in our Doukhobor faith, it's against our beliefs owning private ship land. And that's why the Sons of Freedom, Gilpin and Kristova, they didn't own their land. It was government, I guess, land, and we felt that we were on the right. We could see the assimilation happening amongst other Doukhobors. And if that assimilation continued, Doukhobors would disintegrate, would fall into the rest of the society, and that would be the end of Doukhoborism.
The Doukhobors and Sons of Freedom
support a non-killing society.
The welfare of the world is not worth the life of one child. This religion Doukhobor sect has been in existence for over 200 years. A lot of the general public believed that the Doukhobors were all one group that disrobed, took their clothes off in protest, and we just needed to explain to people that there was part of Doukhobors that took allegiance to the government and land ownership, and then there was those Sons of Freedom who broke away and retaliated by way of protest.
What was the purpose of disrobing? What did that signify? Why was that done?
It was our way of protesting was, if you took everything from us, you might as well take this. We got nothing else. Take everything.
It is unjust to judge people on the surface and say that the Sons of Freedom are willful because of some whim or that they wanted to spite the Canadian government. To suffer such hardships that the Sons of Freedom suffered to the extent of losing their children.
In 1950, there was a huge nude parades, and a lot of our men were arrested. Actually, just about the whole village was arrested and sent to prison for 3 years for just disrobing in Gilpin, which was away from any other people. The children were taken away from them because they wouldn't send their children to school. My wife was one of them children that was incarcerated in New Denver. I spent 4 years in the Agassiz Mountain Prison for acts of violence.
I was barely just turned 11. And when the RCMP came and took us away. And at that time we were I think there was over 100 and something children that were taken away that day. Very traumatic experience, and it was traumatic being there. Something that you were taken away from your family, your parents, your siblings. So it was hard. I can look at my granddaughter now, and you know, she's 10 years old, and I'm looking at her and I said, geez. At that time, I was in New Denver, and we were the older girls, looking after the 6-year-olds. We were used to comb their hair, braid them, wash their clothes.
People died. Families were torn. People lost families. And we were degraded. We were looked down as zealots, whatever, some horrible names were called. And yet, we're people that we feel pain. We feel comfort, discomfort like anybody else. It's sort of even against our principle. Some of those bombings and burnings, it's against our principle. But people did not question their leaders.
Well, we're more into the mainstream of the Doukhobors. We own our land. I don't know if there's too many Sons of Freedom left, or it was, we're more into the stream of the Doukhobors.
We as Canadians have a lot of work to do, because rather than the experience in the United States where people were assimilated into the melting pot, we've pursued a different course here with our multiculturalism and integration rather than assimilation. And that could make our country the richest country in the world in terms of our human composition and our human resources. And it could also be a beacon for the rest of the world on to how to deal with these kinds of challenges. All of these reasons make it important for us to consider how are we going to be stepping into this 21st century. Maybe one of the best things that we could do as Canadians is try to get to know our neighbors better and work to build a better country.
If you have program ideas that you'd like to see on maxTV Local On Demand, write us at max.local@sasktel.com. maxTV programming is now available on maxTV on the go at maxtvonthego.sasktel.com.